return the recording. Let me start again. Greetings, everybody. My name is Wayne Jennings, and I want to personally welcome you to our forum discussion today. Our panel members will be discussing community safety. Our Shaker Heights Unitarian congregation organizes these forums for several reasons: as a congregational service to the community, to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all of us. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to now introduce the coordinator for today's forum, Jean Martin. She will introduce the topic and our speakers. Jean?
George Floyd. We all know the image his death depicts. Police used unnecessary force to confront a suspect. The result was tragedy. It wasn't the first time something like this happened, but it really shook us up. What should be the police role in these times? What's happening now to help police handle situations appropriately? Today, we're talking about community safety challenges, oversight, and reforms. Before I introduce the speakers, I have a few housekeeping notes. A little after 10, we'll have a question and answer period. Go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A now. The button is probably at the bottom of your screen. We'll announce your question by your first name unless you make it anonymous. Please use questions, not comments, and try to keep your questions short so we can get to all the questions. If you'd like to receive our weekly reminders of forums, add your name and email to the chat section and tell us how you heard about it. Or you can also email us at forums@uucleveland.org. This program is being recorded and will be available in a few days on our YouTube channel, which is on our website, uucleveland.org. The YouTube icon is at the top right corner of the homepage. We have with us a distinguished panel. Dr. Daniel Flannery is the director of the Begun Center for Violence Prevention Research and Education at CASE. A clinical psychologist by training, he primarily focuses on violence prevention and the link between violence and mental health. Carole Ballard is director of training and education for the Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services of Cuyahoga County. She has a long history of crisis intervention, counseling, and training for children and adults. In 2019, David Weiss was elected to a 4-year term as mayor of the city of Shaker Heights. Prior to that, he served in Shaker government and has as a council member and committee member, and has many years prior experience in both the legal and business sectors. Shaker Heights Police Chief Jeffrey DeMuth was named to his position in 2016 after longtime service and multiple promotions in the department. Named Police Officer of the Year, he, along with Mayor Weiss, is at the forefront of police reform efforts. And now I turn it over to our panel.
Thanks, Jean. Good morning, everybody. Happy to join you this morning. My job is to lead us off and to sort of give a bit of an overview of all of these issues. So let's start with, of course, the challenges that are occurring right now, because we sure are in a period of time where many challenges are facing our communities. One is the fact that we certainly have experienced an increase in firearm violence and homicides in our communities here in Northern Ohio. I would say that that is a national problem. This is occurring in many cities around the country. I just received an email 2 nights ago from a colleague in Columbus who said, we're experiencing a spike here. Are you experiencing the same things in Cleveland? Unfortunately, that's been going on. Part of it, of course, is, I think, dealing with COVID-19 and all of the effects of COVID, increased isolation and stress. We've seen an uptick in our overdose fatality and use rates. We've seen an increase in our domestic violence calls. Certainly, there's persistent issues with poverty, excuse me, and unemployment. And when you combine all of these things with a decrease in access to services for people that need them, struggles in getting face-to-face time with a therapist, for example, or a counselor. And you overlap that with, unfortunately, still relatively easy access to firearms for people that use them in situations of conflict or stress. You wrap all of that up into instances like what happened with George Floyd and others in our communities, and you can certainly see why this is a persistent and imminent concern for all of us. The new administration does have some things in the works under President Biden around police reform, so that's good. But there's been appropriately to a large degree, discussion nationally about how resources should be allocated to services for law enforcement versus other things. And that's a bigger discussion too. What does it defund the police really mean? Is it taking resources away from law enforcement, or is it a shifting of resources to balance out some of the other things that they're asked to do? So even in our communities here in Northern Ohio, I think there's been over the last year or two, a significant increase in attention to community engagement, to strategies around problem-oriented policing, increased emphasis on accountability for law enforcement, whether that's body camera utilization, increased use of information to track what's occurring in a division, increased transparency with the community, reaching out to the community to get community input and youth voice in terms of our strategies. For example, there is a settlement agreement is still in place with the City of Cleveland Division of Police around use of force and misconduct with the Department of Justice. That does impact Shaker Heights to some degree, where they overlap with the City of Cleveland, and certainly some of the policies that are being put in place on the inner ring suburbs. These are all, I think, important things to remember about increased accountability and attention to community engagement and a different way of policing in our communities. Those kinds of efforts, some of which you're going to hear more about from my colleagues, have led to efforts to change, to make a difference. You'll hear from Carole about the crisis intervention training programs that have been implemented through the Board of Health to increase officer training around mental health and crisis intervention services, where social workers are embedded with officers in a co-responder model, so that these instances can be dealt with more appropriately in a de-escalation kind of model, and individuals can be linked to treatment when they need it. There's a longstanding program in our Public Housing Authority Police Department, which is also now in several districts in Cleveland, called the Police Assisted Referral Program, where officers that respond to a wide range of issues can link a family to a crisis intervention team and additional services as needed. There's actually some evidence in public housing that this has led to a decrease in repeat calls for service to particular addresses, because they are now reaching out to their law enforcement colleagues to report particular instances of quality of life issues, not just waiting for significant crises to occur. You're going to hear about bike patrols and walk and talk strategies and sort of a return to neighborhood-based policing, which is occurring in many of our communities. We've actually done some reverse ride-alongs in Cleveland, where officers are going out to community agencies and to neighborhoods, as opposed to residents riding along with police to see what police do. It's police going out into the community to see what those individuals and organizations are working on. Many of us have been involved in training, increased training around issues related to trauma, brain development, dealing with youth, mental health issues, de-escalation, and the like, which is spread around the county. And there's a new diversion center that is being implemented by the county to kick off here later this month, where individuals with serious mental health or substance use issues can be diverted into treatment as opposed to going to jail. So all of these things, so there are longstanding diversion programs with our juvenile offenders as well, where they're diverted into treatment out of the juvenile justice system. So despite the significant challenges that we face, despite the challenge of changing the way policing is done in the last couple of decades, for sure, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are efforts occurring every day by folks in this room and folks in the audience, I'm sure, to address these issues, but to be held accountable for them in terms of how resources are being allocated and what the impacts and outcomes of these efforts are. So that's sort of the big picture of, I think, where we're at, and you're going to hear more about some of the good things that are happening. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Carole Ballard from the ADAMHS board.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good morning. My name is Carole Ballard, and I'm the Director of Education and Training with the ADAMHS board. And these are challenging times. And this is an interesting discussion for all of us this morning. So I thank you for your attention. For every 10th call that comes to law enforcement, it usually involves a person in crisis with behavioral health related needs. And that's the national data that's out there. Unfortunately, that need continues to rise. And that number that I just quoted you is merely an estimate. For the past 32 years, most law enforcement departments and communities have been made aware of a unique program. It's not just training, called Crisis Intervention Team Program. And the reason why I emphasize that is that the CIT program is an outgrowth of issues related to race, culture, disparity, training, accountability, visibility, and integration and collaboration with law enforcement agencies across the country and the public. So in a true CIT program, you are selecting officers through a vetting process. You are training the best of those departments with more information and tools in their tool belt on how to engage people in crisis. You're collecting data within your individual department on who's calling and what those needs are. And you're assisting in the linkage and relinking for those folks who are experiencing the most amount of trauma in their communities. And you're also continuing the training and specialization of those officers, because it takes special officers to work with special people. In Ohio, we've been implementing CIT training since 2002, in Cuyahoga County since 2004. There are a lot of scattered models related to CIT, but the true model is following those core elements. And as we talked about the challenge, and Dan talked about race, culture, the data and statistics, the CIT program actually began because of issues similar to George Floyd. So think about that 32 years ago. There was a series of violent encounters between law enforcement and the Black community. It was a collaboration between NAMI Memphis and the Memphis Police Department that formed the CIT program. So now let's look at 2021 and beyond. So not only do we have the CIT program as a potential response in the community, but we also have some companion related models. Many of those models are equally has a historical value as well. The Cahoots model that many of you have heard about out of Portland, out of Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, is a model in which social workers, peer support workers, and an EMT tech actually respond to 911 calls for nonviolent emergencies. Because what we know about crisis is that a good percentage of those calls have little or nothing to do with violence. It has everything to do with staying connected, needing to be connected, and responding to a person in crisis. The STAR program is another example coming out of Denver. They just started in August of 2020 and have responded to over 748 calls, a social worker, an EMT tech, and a peer support worker. So there are non-law enforcement models out there as well as co-responder. We heard Jean talk about that earlier. Co-responder models are considered companion models, where in fact a CIT officer and a mental health worker ride together to respond secondarily to calls. They do the follow-up from CIT related calls. And they're usually part of a robust CIT program. So that means that it's an established CIT program within that police department. There's some agreement within city government and others that a civilian can ride with an officer, and it's a designated program within the police department as well as where the agency, if that person is employed by an agency. There's been some good evidence on the ability to reduce the call volume, reduce the use of emergency rooms, as well as create follow-up and linkage. All of these are not new to our community, but there's a growing interest in how do we change the trajectory based upon the national headlines related to violence in the community, police response, and community collaborations. This gives, there's a number of different options that are always going to be available. In our CIT program or CIT training that we offer through the ADAMHS board, we have increased the volume of training to police because we know that training and continued training is always helpful, but not only to police, but to behavioral health communities as well. Because training is part of building an ongoing platform towards education. Communication and de-escalation can happen at almost any level. It actually begins at the dispatch level. That's why we offer CIT training for dispatch. And then it coordinates with law enforcement, and then it can go into EMS, fire, and other first responders. So there's various levels of training related to CIT in terms of who those first responders are that can assist us with people in crisis. I want to turn it over now to Mayor David Weiss from the city of Shaker Heights. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And let me start by saying I feel confident that I can speak on behalf of all the panelists in saying that we appreciate this opportunity to be with you this morning to talk about these very important topics. In particular, I appreciate the efforts of Jean Martin, a former neighbor of mine. I've known for many years. I appreciate her efforts and the efforts of all of the congregation to hold these important forums, and the one particularly this morning to address these very, very important issues. So with that, let me, I'll try to be brief, but I thought I'd just mention a little bit in my opening remarks about where we've been and where we are headed in Shaker in particular. As most of you know, diversity has always been a core value in Shaker Heights and an important part of all of what we do. And since Chief DeMuth became chief in 2016, really the administration and the city working with the community has worked hard to improve policing and community relations. Let me just give you a few examples of some of the things that Shaker has really been at the forefront of in many, compared to many of other communities. Things like accreditation. Our police department's been accredited for more than 30 years through CALIA, which is a national accreditation standard, really sort of the gold standard for accreditation. We were an early adopter of both police officer cruiser dash cams, as well as body cameras. We started implementing automobile cameras over 10 years ago, and body cameras over 6 years ago. We can talk a little bit more about that, but it's an important thing that we did very, very early on compared to most other communities. Community outreach and community policing efforts have always been a part of what we have done, depending on a variety of situations and aspects, including resources. But for instance, in 2018, we reinstituted our bike patrol. And so, which has been very well received in our community. We've increased training and implemented some protocols in our hiring process to increase diversity in our police force to reflect the community, and love to talk a little bit more about that perhaps in the Q&A. So all of these things have been what we have been doing for a number of years, but obviously events of the past year or so and before that, frankly, have caused all of us to redouble and deepen our efforts in this area. So let me talk a little bit briefly about where we are going from here. And we're doing a number of things, and I'll just touch on it here, and then we'll talk a little bit more in the Q&A. But we're doing some things both structurally and programmatically. Structurally, we're in the midst of and have adopted a new DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion mission statement. We're continuing and increasing our community engagement. We're elevating what has been for a long time our Human Relations Task Force, incorporating those activities and others into a City Council committee, which, for those of you who know Shaker, we have a very robust committee structure to receive input from our community. We just, even in a tight budget during this pandemic, we found dollars to hire a chief diversity officer. We just recently posted that position and already have quite a bit of interest. So we're happy about that and look forward to filling that position. One of the things that we also believe strongly in is that you can't look at one aspect of this problem and think that that will solve all problems. So what we're doing is incorporating all of our DEI initiatives into everything we do. So not only in the policing area, but as things as wide range as procurement and economic development and so forth, and love to talk a bit more about that. But of course, in the policing area, Chief DeMuth has been very active as I mentioned, for many years. Last year, we announced the adoption of our first round. We're constantly in the process of reviewing our policies, but we announced the first set of revisions to our internal policies, and we're now on to our second round of policy changes. We also recognize, as you heard from Dan and Carole, we've seen an increase in mental health related issues in our community. No community is immune to this. And so we put in place some programs leading up to today, our family safety program, which we can talk a little bit about. But we actually, working with both our council members and the community, have talked about a more robust mental health response. We had the pleasure of working with Carole, she provided us some very great input on what we might do in Shaker. And actually, we are presenting to City Council tomorrow evening our recommendations from the administration, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, it's a three-prong approach of training, proactive outreach, and then intervention with social work or other types of social service intervention during the course of our interactions. That, along with the recent announcement, which I'm sure others will talk, Carole in particular will also talk about the County Diversion Center, are key components of our of how we as a community as well as a region hope to respond to this growing problem. So with that, that's just an overview, and with that, I will turn it over to my colleague and Police Chief Jeff DeMuth.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for having me here today. I very much appreciate it. I look forward always to these discussions to talk about policing, and what I'm going to mention today are some high-level thoughts in regards to police reform, and then just a little bit of detail as to how the Shaker Heights Police Department was involved in police reform. And then moving forward, where do we go from here? As Jean spoke about in her opening remarks, the death of George Floyd in May of 2020 and the subsequent social protests across the nation forced municipalities and their police department to perform important internal examinations and reform policy, protocol, and probably most importantly, culture. Unfortunately, and this is my opinion, unfortunately, the pressure of these events caused some to move quicker than needed and made or promised drastic changes without fully vetting those consequences. And I think those consequences caused unintended consequences in some municipalities where they exacerbated already dire situations and really was not providing the reform that was needed for the people that needed the reform the most. So when we talk about reimagining policing or police reform, it's important to understand that those words mean something different to everybody. And because they mean something different to everybody, it's hard to find mutually agreed upon solutions. But what I'd like to say here today is that in general, policing is not broken. And in fact, the good police officers are very good at what they do. We just need to realign. As Carole, or I'm sorry, as Jean talked about, what is the role of policing in these times? And I think we need to do some realignment. In regards to police reform and reimagining policing, I believe it needs to be purposeful and intentional. I think you start with policy reform. That's one part of it. It's important that agency leaders compile as much information from as many sources, a wide array of sources as possible. And those sources has to include community input. Absolutely. They should synthesize that information and then change or amend those policies that need changing for best practices to be utilized by the agencies. These changes ultimately need to make sense for the residents in your individual community, and those changes need to fit the unique personality of each individual community. And I think it's important to understand that when you're talking about reimagining policing or police reform, not one size fits all. And that's the case because each individual community is unique and has their own unique issues and problems. But I think eventually, when you get to the bottom of police reform and you have consulted with all your sources, including community input, I think you're able to amend or change or add policies that all the stakeholders can at least accept. Part and parcel to police reform is training. A very important part, and Carole talked about it, Dan talked about it. And it's important that when you amend or add these new policies that you include training with it. In-service and external classroom training is important, but more importantly, in regards to the training, and we do this constantly in our department, is you have to provide dynamic simulation training where you're requiring your officers in a display of in a hands-on environment to tell you as the trainer how they interpret these policy changes and utilize the techniques that they have learned. You could spend all day in a classroom, but until you put it in a hands-on environment, you really never know if they're able to meet the standards of your policy changes. We have been doing this for years and we continue to do it. And I think probably the most important aspect of police reform and reimagining policing is changing the culture of your individual police organization. And in our department, this work began about 5 years ago. And we started when we changed our mission statement. Interestingly enough, prior to composing our mission statement, we put a survey on Facebook, on our Facebook page, and we asked our residents just exactly what do you want us to focus on? What's important to you as residents? And so with that Facebook input, we were able to create a new mission and a mission statement. And that mission statement is posted conspicuously all over our police department. So when our officers walk through our department every day, they understand exactly what our community wants from them. In addition to changing, or in addition to working on the culture of our police department, we began talking a long time ago about changing the overall mindset of our officers. And I'm sure many of you on here have heard about this, changing the mindset of the officer from a warrior to guardian. And there's a lot of characteristics of the warrior to guardian mindset, and we could talk about this in the chat if people wish to. But what's most important is when you look to change that mindset of the officer, it's sometimes difficult in the newer officers because they come into police work in what I call this pre-entry stage mindset. And that's how the applicants view themselves in the role, in their police role. And that view may be based on real or imagined perceptions. And many of those perceptions, as I'm sure you guys, you folks understand, is heavily influenced by popular culture and TV shows. And I submit today, many of those TV shows are not what our communities want us to be as police officers. I mean, think about it. I don't think it's on TV anymore, but just the show Cops, right? It was real live viewing of what a police officer does, but I don't think it did us any good as a profession to show that show, to air that show. And then to sum it all up in regards to changing the culture of your organization, education, and I don't mean necessarily training, it is in training, but education of your officers is imperative. And that education has to include cultural competency, it has to include community diversity, and implicit bias training. And it's important that we sit down as an organization and we acknowledge the history of racial minorities and others who have faced injustice at the hands of police in general in our nation. One of our greatest challenges is we, the police, understand that we are sometimes serving disproportionately minority communities. And often our population as a police department is not reflective of the populations you're policing. And in terms of variables and demographics, and it's also not reflective of the lived experiences in that community. That's an important educational concept for your police department. In essence, you know, our officers need to understand, again, these past and present inequities in some communities that shapes the views and drives these calls for change, these important calls for change. Obviously, there are many, many challenges related to what I just spoke about. And I really just provided an overview in regards to police reform and everything that goes with it. And this is a very, very complex topic. And it has tentacles and corollaries that reach out in many, many directions. And part of the challenge of all of this is it takes commitment, patience, funding, and a vast amount of human resources, to be quite honest with you. But to sum it all up, and you know, Gene talked about it. What is the police role in today's society? But it's important to understand, Dan foreshadowed a little bit, is how did we get to where we are right now, and where do we go? And I think it's important to understand that in the late 70s, kind of early 80s, and I was hired in 1986, so I kind of understand all this. That the idea of community policing brought about fundamental changes to law enforcement. And those fundamental changes involve communities that encouraged our profession to be more proactive than reactive. Essentially, community policing encouraged the use of partnerships and problem solving for public safety issues, and communities prioritize police response. The result of this, and I don't want anybody to think that I don't think this was a good idea, but the result of this dramatically expanded the types of issues and incidents that police responded to. Due to the increased calls for service, police and the broader criminal justice system in my opinion, became the government's de facto first responders to police, to persons suffering from mental health issues, drug and alcohol addiction, and chronic homelessness. And this snowball has been rolling downhill for 40 years and gaining momentum. And quite frankly, I thank the Lord for Dan and Carole, because they're true assets to our profession. The training for officers has not kept pace. It has not kept pace for the request for police response to non-law enforcement types of calls for service. And Carole talked about it. In my opinion, we must, our present policing models have been built and modeled on institutional legacies that may not be appropriate for today's communities. I think we see that more and more. And we talked about it a little bit today right now. I think we need to disconnect from the defund the police model and reimagine what justice and public safety looks like for our communities. And we need to fund to those models. I believe communities and governments should look for a different model of public safety. And example that I think, and this is just some food for thought that I think we all should think of for the future. And it's not going to happen overnight, and it will not happen overnight. But I think we're evolving towards this, is that we should have police, fire, EMS, and mental health response units under one umbrella of the Department of Public Safety and for each community. And I think government should properly staff and support appropriately trained first responders for all those units for comprehensive public safety and delivery of appropriate services to those who need them. And the obvious concept is this, is that those calls for service should be responded to or answered by those who are most qualified to respond to them and provide the best services to those who need them. Thank you for having me today, and looking forward to continued conversation in our question and answer.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's comforting to know that these issues can and are being addressed in a productive and caring way. And now I'll turn over to Debbie and Laura for the Q&A.
First of all, I'll also thank all of you for your astute comments. We recognize you have very challenging jobs, and thank you for being here. And The last comments that Jeff made bring me to a question from Eileen, which is sort of connected. Eileen asked, how did the phrase defund the police become a part of common conversation about social justice and policing? Has this phrase contributed to the divisive nature of the conversation about safety and societal issues?
I don't know, honestly, I don't know where it came from, or I do know. Go ahead, Carol, if you want to talk.
No, I'm just going to say that it actually came out of the last case with George Floyd and with the community in Minneapolis. They were the first to say, we need to defund the police department. And then others actually followed. And in fact, I think it's Newcastle, New Jersey, they actually have a model that's very similar, where some of the public safety dollars actually went into social services. So it actually came out of the George Floyd era very directly. And you saw signs in those protests that say, defund the police. But it has that growing metamorphosis throughout the country where others are saying, maybe that's what we need to do. But Chief, go ahead. That was my recollection when I first saw it.
Yeah, and all I was going to comment is, I don't know where the genesis, but I first remember hearing it, obviously, in early summer of last year. And I will be brief with those comments because the question was about the divisive nature. I can tell you how it affects our department and our officers, and I can tell you how it affects officers, at least in Cuyahoga County and maybe in Ohio, is they're very concerned. They feel that people are coming after their jobs, and that causes the way they respond and react to the way they do their job. So it's my responsibility to make sure that they understand that, at least in the city of Shaker Heights, people are not coming after their jobs, but they also have to understand that there is some positive things out of that very negative situation that came out of the George Floyd situation that, I just discussed, and we need to move forward towards.
I would just,
Let me just say too, that we do see impacts of this issue on the recruitment in police departments around the county. Fewer individuals are applying to become police officers right now because of some concerns, I think, about whether resources will be there to support what they need to do. So defund the police is different from shifting the resources around in terms of what we ask officers to do as first responders. And I think that's an important distinction.
An anonymous speaker would like to know, what are the average number of police calls for help on weekdays or weekends, and approximately how many of these calls could be reclassified as mental health issues? Just to get an idea of how big your police force needs to be as you're thinking about reorganization.
So I don't have those statistical numbers exactly.
Okay.
I think we calculated that we had approximately
15%.
last year about 300
A little higher, 400.
to 400 mental health calls. Every year we do a examination of our police force, and we insert vetted statistical models related to our staffing. And we are exactly, and when I say exactly, we are exactly where we need in regards to those statistical models that are provided, like through PERF and IECP. We are exactly staffed as to how we should be staffed. Numbers.
I just wanted to mention, as part of the work that we're doing in terms of the rollout of this new mental health response, we looked at those statistics, and as the chief mentioned, yeah, it was roughly 15%-ish or so were mental health related calls as we define them, which was fairly broad to make sure we were catching most of those. I should also just mention, going back just for a moment to the last question about defunding the police, I think while clearly there are some communities that are taking that very literally, I think there are other communities that are saying, there may be a need for some reallocation of resources, but we frankly need more in the social service side, which is interesting when you think about where services are provided. And I'll just mention this, that where you have law enforcement, which is generally funded at the local level here in Cuyahoga County, but your significant social services are provided in large part at the county level. And so actually being able to reallocate resources becomes a challenge when you have sort of structural issues. But nevertheless, for many people, it's a reallocating and frankly, an increase in funding for mental health, which has been chronically, I think most would agree, has been chronically underfunded for many, many years.
I think we understand from previous comments that the Shaker Police Department has implemented for many years programs in safety and diversity for their police officers. Mark is wondering, since the death of George Floyd, have there been additional measures taken by Shaker Heights and the city of Cleveland to encourage greater police officer safety measures when they are approaching citizens?
I can't speak for Cleveland. It would be inappropriate for me to do that. But yeah, absolutely. And I kind of talked about that in regards to reimagining policing and what we have done. We reformed our policies. We amended some policies, and then we added additional policies. We provided the training that is needed in regards to those amended or added policies. And then also, again, 5 years ago, we started to try to change the culture of this department. And I would just add, and I know I need to be brief, but one of the policies that we added is called the duty to intervene. And I will tell you this, when I started in 1986, I never thought there would ever need to be a policy that told me as a human being, I need to intervene when I see something that is going wrong. But we have added it, and I think it's a good policy, but it just speaks to where we are today about policing.
Well, Khalil was asking, how does Shaker Heights enforce compliance with body and dash camera use? I mean, policy's good, but what happens right there in the police car?
Dan, did you want to talk about before that question?
I was just going to make a quick comment about Cleveland that, yeah, they have implemented strategies prior to George Floyd, such as voluntarily taking on body cameras, which was not a requirement of the settlement agreement. And they're actually have a policy in place that moving forward, officers are required to spend on average 20% of their time on duty in community engagement activities. So there's a very purposeful attempt around training and policy and practice to transition, it is part of culture, but it's an expectation and a way of policing as opposed to just responding to a singular training around a specific issue. So.
But the question is how do you make sure they turn their cameras on? I remember in the newspaper, I've read a few instances where one person put their camera on, but maybe another person didn't. And in the car is different than the policy at the administration level.
Certainly we have a policy in regards to use of our body worn cameras, but we also do audits. Our supervisors do audits every month for every officer to ensure that their body cameras are being activated when they need to be activated. Absolutely, there are times when our officers forget to do it based on what they're responding to do. Or what they're asked to respond to, especially a dynamic situation that needs their immediate attention. What we also do during those audits is that if we find an officer who hasn't done it, we look at the situation as a whole, and then we document that. And if we find repeated instances of that with one officer, so to speak, then certainly progressive discipline is utilized.
Sort of a follow-up question is there, what's the relationship of the police union within this compliance? Because I know in some departments that seems to be an issue.
We have had a pretty good relationship with our police union. They have not disagreed with anything that we are doing now or we plan to do. We try to get the union involved as much as we can because essentially policy change, all that we talked about has to do with the lives of the officers in that union. So you want to obtain buy-in in connection to your policy changes and training and cultural changes, all those things we talked about. But we have not run into any issues with the unions that represent our employees.
Yeah, just mention on the body worn cameras, just some points of reference. You know, we've, as I mentioned, we've been supportive and have used them for quite a while. I think the chief would agree. We don't have generally have not had sort of ongoing or systematic issues with our officers wearing or turning them on. I will say this though, that these systems are very expensive and that's part of the funding aspect. I saw a statistic in the Plain Dealer relating to the governor's budget that of the 900 law enforcement agencies roughly in the state of Ohio, only about 180 of those actually are wearing body worn cameras. And in many cases, communities say they can't afford to have these. And so having additional funding to provide this statewide becomes very, very important. It's just,
yeah, and let's face it, who'd want to have a camera on all the time when you're working? But that's just a personal aside.
yeah.
I wouldn't want it. But if you had an anonymous attendee wants to know if you had a much bigger police budget for your police department, what would your main priorities be to spend it on?
Well, I'm a big proponent of training. I don't think you can do too much training. And based on where we are and the role of being asked of police officers today, I don't know how much this anonymous person wants to increase my budget, but the more, the better, because when you look at all the things that police officers today are asked to respond to, they are not trained as well as I would like them to be trained to be able to handle all those situations. So it would be the training.
Well, there was that question that mental health in the county is separate from the police department. Would you want a mental health component in your police department because the county's too far away to coordinate with?
I will let Dan and Carole talk about that, but from my perspective, I think I ended up my initial comments with that. I think that communities and their police departments need to reimagine how they put their organizational chart together. And I think, again, it should all be under a Department of Public Safety. And one of those units in that department would be a mental health response unit.
With the ridiculously small cities we have in eastern side of Cleveland, would it be better to have it more regional rather than within each city?
Well, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some county driven, there's a quick response team right now that's county based around responding to opioid overdose incidents. There are some things, and there's a sexual assault kit, county response team. So there's a way to do it. It's not mutually exclusive to have trained mental health persons embedded with a local police department, but coordinate with county services. Again, these things take time and effort, and you're putting multiple people in a zone car, for example, if they're riding along literally, or they're available in a crisis mode to be called for service and respond, within 24 hours. These are all resource heavy kinds of models. So it really depends, A, on resources, and B, the priorities of the local community.
So
You want to talk about the center?
what I would say about that is that we have 53 municipalities in this county. And the chief mentioned earlier, no one resource fits all. And in larger communities like Chicago and New York, they actually have regional mental health related units that are embedded within a police department, that where the funding actually goes to those departments, so that they could actually have some control over those units. And so I think that looking at the modeling, because if you embedded a social worker in every department, it still wouldn't achieve that larger goal. It would only peel back on the onion, and some departments need certain resources and others may not, because usually the underpinning is a robust CIT program and not just CIT training. So I think that more discussion at a broader level needs to occur, so that you're not just recreating and implanting social workers all over the county who are not coordinated and working together and don't really know what each other is actually doing. Then you're creating even more silos. So models that they have out in LA and the Denver area probably are more appropriate than just single type of co-responder related units. That's my comment, but Chief and Mayor, you may have some additional comments as well.
No, let me just add, I very much agree with many of Carole's comments. Yeah, with the number of municipalities, you're in some cases you run the risk of diluting resources in a way that I think that you avoid on a more regional basis. And these facilities are, we're talking about, you've probably been reading about the County Diversion Center. I mean, that project is, as I understand it, is a $20 million project. And each community just simply can't, our budgets are stretched so thin to date. It's very, very hard. And I'm a big believer in a regional approach. Having said that, the reality is that our first responders, police and EMS, are the first ones to a situation. And so the question really is, how do you bring to bear the right resources to each one of these particular situations? Which, let me just mention as an example of one way we try to address this. This is what I mentioned that we already have in place, the Family Safety Program. This is a completely voluntary program, but we have outreach to our community that enables families who may have a family member with mental health issues to alert our joint dispatch and our first responders that there is a family member with mental health issues, so that when a call might come in to that location, our first responders know in advance, at least, that they have a heads up that there may be an issue relating to maybe a mental health related issue. That kind of information is completely voluntary. No one's requiring you to do it, but if you're comfortable doing that, we have very good relationships with many of with our residents who we work with closely on these kinds of issues. So that's where we talk about our mental health program. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to address a hybrid program where we try to address the issues, particularly known issues, by providing in advance these access to services, so we avoid the 911 call to begin with. But of course, there'll always be some that will come in through 911. So we need to be able to respond to those mental health issues where we may not have advanced knowledge of it. But those are the kinds of things that I think Carole's mentioning, that we really, you tailor it to your particular community. So the initial response, I think, is something that should be handled at the local level, because the mayors and police chiefs, et cetera, really know their community best.
So at the county level, we've mentioned this, and I wanted to make sure that I mention it before we close. The Cuyahoga County Diversion Center will be opening April 1st. The ADAMHS board is the facilitator, the fiscal agent for this facility. We're contracting with Oriana House and Frontline Services, along with Lifelong Transportation. The facility is open and available to law enforcement agencies for referral for persons in crisis who have mental health and or substance related issues at the pre-arrest stage. So that means that you're choosing not to arrest, but you're choosing to access treatment. And a call goes out to the crisis call center, which is operated by Frontline Services, to kind of screen and review and respond and forward that information on to the diversion center and or our crisis stabilization unit and or advisements towards the local ER. So that's a county effort to try to localize and try to respond to some of these issues. More work is still needed at the local level to re-engage mental health providers for the follow-up with these clients in crisis, because that's the key. You can bring them to us, but the key is our response within the system. So I wanted to make sure, because I've heard us mention it a couple of times, April 1st is when we open. Officers that come to upcoming CIT training being offered by the board and or dispatch or CIT refresher training are getting an overview of this model as we speak. So thank you.
Sounds good. And the police department provides the transport, not you, right?
Correct.
The CIT
had
training that
several-
Carol's talking about is part of our planned mental health response as well.
We've had several questions about policing in schools. Should schools have their own police force, or should local police forces protect schools, or should there be coordination between school police forces and the local police? What's going on in local communities, especially Shaker and Cleveland? And another question from someone else, are they trained in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So for 30 years, I would say, we have had police officers inside the Shaker Heights schools. I think the way we do it works very well. They are not dressed in uniforms. They're dressed very casually. And really, we look at this as kind of a community engagement, community outreach opportunity for our officers to be in the same environment with those students. And what you'll find is that many of our officers will have these relationships built with many of these children. And after they graduate, they still have these relationships kind of from an advisory role. I don't know about the separate police department for school systems. I can't comment on Cleveland. I know that certainly our model has worked well for us. And it's a co-model, it's through the authority of the school system. But I think it's worked well for us since we've had it.
Do you share costs between the city and the school? I mean, the police department and the schools?
The schools pay the pay this
Officer salary.
entirely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Keith, do you want to mention
Tell us.
the interaction we have with youth generally as well? So there's the physical presence in the schools, but there's also our interaction.
Yeah, I certainly prior to COVID, I have to qualify it. Prior to COVID, we tried to do a lot of programming and engagement with the students. We are engaged right now with the SAMS program, where we're involved with community conversations, and that's specifically centered around youth, African-American youth. But yeah, we've had a long history of being involved with our youth through a number of programs, some of which have been successful and some of which we found weren't very successful. But we're going to continue to work along those lines. It's something personally that I enjoy, and I've enjoyed my whole career. I had a stint in our juvenile unit, and I had long and enduring relationships with a lot of kids, and now they're obviously adults and on their own. But it's certainly something that's part of the fabric of what we do.
Nice. I
Yeah,
think we, okay, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say Cleveland has a safety force separate from the police department. There are fairly high standards for school resource officers for training specific to working with young people and in schools. So it's different than just assigning an officer to a school as a place. You need the right kind of officer with the right interests and background and training. And we need to be careful. There is some evidence that placing law enforcement in schools leads to greater discipline in the juvenile justice system that is disproportionate to minority youth. So you want to make sure they're not just there, quote unquote, in a law enforcement discipline capacity. The last thing I'll say is that there is some controversy in Ohio with some Supreme Court cases about arming teachers when law enforcement is not able to be in the school. And we need to play that out in terms of the amount of training. If a teacher, a staff person decides to carry a firearm within a school, what does that mean? And what are the requirements for that person who may not be sworn a law enforcement officer with the requisite training that they receive?
So the other thing that I would add to school resource officers is that one of the things that might be helpful is actually offering school resource specific training around communication and de-escalation and some common scenarios, because it's one of those unique aspects of policing, and every school district actually handles it differently. And having some kind of county-wide structure like that might give some bearing to that. And Dan, you are correct, because that is the pipeline for the disproportionate number of minority youth who are actually going to be charged and viewed in juvenile court and some of these other alternative methods. So having some training around diversity related issues, whether it's working with adults or working with youth, is going to be standard, should be standard in almost any training that you do, because race matters.
Right. We only have a few minutes left. Here's a question. Are the police academies working on the mindset of the trainees? And does that affect which schools you tend to work with?
That's a very complex question. I could say generally, I'd like to say yeah. But in my opinion, I think OPATA and OPATA and the academies that are associated with OPATA, the training is still behind. And
Yes.
there's so much, I mean, we don't have the time nor capacity to talk about it today, but there is so much information that you are struggling to get to police recruits under, I mean, it was 500 hours when I went through it 35 years ago. I think it's 700 and some odd hours now, 732, and it's still not enough. It's still not enough. So what we try to do is we supplement that training when they get out of the academy, and in their PTO process can last 6 to 8 months. We have an orientation program, and part of that orientation program talks to what that question is. And what I felt was important is I deliver the ethics. I deliver the ethics talk to every person that gets hired there, because I think it's important that all of our officers understands ethics are important, and it starts at the top, and it should permeate throughout our organization.
So my comment about that is that I'm an OPATA instructor, and I teach in what they call human relations, which is the crisis intervention section. And the OPATA training, as Chief mentioned, is far behind. And we can augment that training. There's a way that you can augment it to make it more contemporary. In Ohio, it's up to 24 hours. When we first started, making changes in the curriculum many years ago, it was about 6 to 8 hours. So it's up to 24 hours for recruits, but it's still not quite there. What we know about the content and we know about recruits is that recruits need to know how to be a police officer before they become a CIT officer. So most departments are supplementing the OPATA training with their in-house training once those recruits come out. And that's an important ingredient. Cleveland does that as well. OPATA has a new team approach and a new curriculum that they want to be rolling out over the next year or so. And so we'll see what that human relations area is about, particularly related to behavioral health. So they're a work in progress, but they're a little further along than other states. Thank you.
Eileen says, can you define OPATA?
Ohio Police Training Association.
Thank you.
Which is governed through OPOTC, which is the Ohio Police Officer Training Council.
Yes.
Anything else, Laura?
Just to thank our speakers this morning, and also for being with us during the Q&A. And we want to thank everyone who asked questions. We obviously can't get to all of the questions in this brief time, but we tried to cover as many as we could. And we appreciate your involvement.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so
I'm
much
so
for having.
glad.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you all could join us today. Since we couldn't get to all the questions, I'd like to ask if the speakers to put their emails in the chat, and you can contact them directly with your questions. Next Sunday, our Zoom forum is titled Anti-Semitism, Beliefs and Facts. Our speaker will be Mark Weber. He's a retired Kent State librarian and a local activist. He'll talk about various aspects of anti-Semitism, including whether it's anti-Semitic to criticize the Israeli government's policy of occupying the West Bank. At 11 today, we invite you to join our virtual Sunday service by going to our website, uucleveland.org, and clicking on the panel, Our Next Virtual Service. This week, the service celebrates in words and song the sixth Unitarian principle, building a fair and peaceful world. Thanks again for joining us. Wayne, do you have anything to add?
No, we're done. I'm going to stop the recording and release everybody to go to the service at 11 o'clock. Thank you, everybody. A terrific program. And
Thank you.
Maybe we'll
you.
have a redo of this maybe in a year or so, and a progress report if you would be willing.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Enjoy the Super Bowl.
Oh, Chiefs.